Welcome to Constraints of Comedy and Choice in Computer Role-Playing Games. Sorry about the long title. I'm Matt MacLean, Senior Designer at Obsidian Entertainment. Focus of this talk is the belief, the hypothesis, the theory at least, that good development comes from anticipation and the embracing of limits and not necessarily trying to shove everything into a game that you want. I'm going to talk about this mainly by exploring my work on or the development of South Park: The Stick of Truth. When I was first asked to come here and speak, I was hoping to talk about Pillars of Eternity, but my PR department told me that there's a lot of great news coming soon. I can't tell you about it. I can tell you the news is coming, but I can't tell you about it further. So check out our website for more information. There'll be stuff soon. And just as a forward, I'm talking about South Park. South Park can be kind of offensive, and yeah, if I really can't talk about the making of this game without mentioning Hitler and sodomy. So if things like that bother you, and if spoilers bother you, I won't be offended if you leave. All right, a little bit about me. I'm a little man who makes video games. I've been a professional game designer since 2004. I've been working at Obsidian since 2006, and I've had the luxury, the privilege, the honor, really, of working on a bunch of different RPGs and working on different disciplines within design. I've worked on area design, narrative and writing, and systems design. I find all elements of design really fascinating. My most recent work has been on South Park: The Stick of Truth. I was the lead designer of a team that fluctuated, but was usually about 10 people. And my work on that project was a little over 3 years. And then right after, and it's worth noting that I cut off my beard very early into the project, so this beard is as long as South Park is. And ladies, my eyes are up here. Right when I was done with South Park, I leapt on to Pillars of Eternity, where I was a writer for Quests and Companions. You might be wondering what I wrote. I like to think I inspired this guy. But I actually wrote this guy, so that was my work on the game. Both of these were computer role-playing games, but they were as different as can be. Pillars of Eternity was I guess for lack of a better term, a super serious RPG. It was very heavy on quests that you could solve in multiple ways, dialogues that had lots of branching, and it was made on a Kickstarter budget of approximately $5 million. And South Park: The Stick of Truth, on the other hand, was a comedy RPG. It was very heavy on cutscenes and voice acting, which was something that we didn't have a lot of in Pillars of Eternity. And I actually don't know or chose not to remember how much the game actually cost, but it was had two publishers involved, THQ and then later Ubisoft, and it also was made in partnership with South Park Digital Studios. And these were both similar triumphs. They were both creator-controlled games, more so than anything we've worked on at our studio. Pillars of Eternity was controlled by us. Certainly we had Kickstarter demands that we wanted to meet, but we were technically in control. And South Park: The Stick of Truth had executive control in the hands of Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The creators of South Park really had full control of this game. And I don't know if review scores tell you if a game is really successful or not, but both of them reviewed really well. And I think they sold really well. Pillars of Eternity just came out recently, so we don't know the exact figures. And funny thing about publishers, they spend time telling you how much the game sold so they can drag their feet sending you a royalty report, so they can drag their feet sending you a royalty payment. Fun. The topic of this discussion is design by constraints, and I'd like to talk about the unusual challenge of Stick of Truth, and I want to cover it in 3 parts. In narrative, where I talk about getting text in the game, dealing with voiceover and localization. Content development, where I talk about how we built this crazy world, and then the RPG systems and difficulty, where I talk about the nerdy stuff. So starting with the narrative, when we first got this project handed to us, it was kind of a scary thought. Like, a comedy RPG is not something I would say is a easy thing to make. Comedy is a tool. It's not something that you really rest your game on. And some games do comedy really well, but like Monkey Island is a adventure game first that just happens to use comedy really well. Most games that try to be funny kind of fail, or are very short, or are unintentionally funny. But from a publisher point of view, this seemed brilliant. Of course, Matt and Trey will write a bunch of jokes, Obsidian will make a game, and then we just magically put it all together, make some money. From a publisher point of view, it just seemed like a winning recipe. But really, kind of one of the major goals going in here is we didn't want to make just a licensed game that had South Park assets put on top of it. There have been some South Park games made in the past that were just, a racing game with some South Park graphics thrown onto it. And this was going to be Matt and Trey's new passion project, for lack of a better term. They make their show in the fall and spring seasons, and in the summer they sometimes get bored and make movies or make musicals. They're smart guys. And this is going to be their next kind of big project between TV seasons. So we had this question of, well, what kind of RPG are we making? RPGs are long, really long, and for years and years and years, South Park has told stories that hit the reset button every half hour. They can blow up the town, kill people off, hit the reset button, problem solved. You don't actually have to worry about the consequences of the story you're telling, but a big RPG has to keep going. Your character has to have continuity. How do you keep it up for that long, so to speak? And we also knew that there was an iconic art style that we had to do, or this project just wasn't going to happen. RPGs also usually mean big open world that you can kind of travel in any order. So we had both a world that we had to create and match this art style, and let you move around a lot. We didn't have a whole lot to work with when we started this project. Not surprised, we didn't have a script or anything like that, or even a sense of where the plot was going. But the game started with a cartoon that Matt and Trey had put together that was about maybe just 2 minutes, and it had some elements of gameplay that surprisingly made it all the way to the final game. It has a new kid coming to South Park. His parents tell him to go make some friends so they can have sex. And you go down the street and you meet Butters and you meet Cartman and you start playing this game. We never called it D&D or LARPing or everything like that. It was just the game they're playing. And it didn't have the final art here, but it was just a pencil drawing of Cartman answering at his door to greet you. But that one little vision for this game stayed all the way through to the end. But that's really all we had to start with. We just knew that this was going to be some brand new story. They didn't want to do a recycled best of all their seasons. They wanted to make a new story that they were interested in telling. So where are we going to go? RPGs are really text-heavy endeavors. When we put together all the words used in Fallout New Vegas for dialogue, cutscenes, describing your abilities, describing how the UI works, books you find, the words were just far in excess of an entire season of South Park. Probably more than 2 seasons, probably more than 3, actually. I don't know the exact numbers, but it was just a staggering amount of text compared to what these guys are used to. And there was also just kind of the grim reality that these guys are really, really busy. Even though they were very passionate about making this game, they have a television show to make. They have kids. They have a business. So we always knew that we were going to try to find some way to get as much of their time as we can. And I wouldn't normally list this as one of our challenges because I'm very proud of the fact that Obsidian has always localized their games and sold to the worldwide market. The fact that I'm here today means that it's a good thing to do, right? But this game especially had some challenges because not only do we want to ship it worldwide, we wanted to ship it on 3 platforms worldwide, and that caused some problems later. So I want to start with talking about what went right with our narrative design. And one of the things that I think is easy to overlook is the fact that really early on we set smart limits. And talking to Matt and Trey, there was a lot of explaining to them how we make games and sort of having a back and forth about where do you guys see this game going, because here's how games actually get made. And one of the questions was, are you going to talk a lot? In an RPG, except maybe for Diablo, you kind of assume that talking to people is going to be a thing. And that's great and all, but if you have multiple responses, there's multiple lines of dialogue that you have to write, and if there's multiple responses to those, you can get bigger and bigger. And we use really simple dialogue trees in South Park Stick of Truth. If you meet Mr. Kim, he might have met you for the first time, or have a quest to give you, or he's just saying hello again. But we knew we didn't want to get into branching dialogue because it can get out of control. Here's, each of those is one little note of dialogue. This is Pillars of an Eternity dialogue, particularly big one. If you happen to know which one that is, you're amazing or psychic. But we knew that this was not going to be right for South Park. If you almost just look at the logistics of it, you could write a conversation that has 3 funny ways to go through it, and the player's only ever going to see one unless they play the game a second time. Or you could write 3 funny conversations, and the player's going to see all 3. So even though branching dialogue is something that most people would expect in an RPG, we just knew it wasn't for this game. We also had the question of whose story is this? You normally think of South Park, you think of the 4 boys. Are you just going to be tagging along on the 4 boys and hearing them say funny things? It was actually really important that for Matt and Trey, they wanted to have a story that was about you, the new kid coming to South Park. And you needed to be the focus of the game, not the boys. And they wanted a silent protagonist, partly because I think they thought that no voice could really fit every person who's going to play the game. And that being a silent protagonist really fits into the South Park experience. You're a new kid, nobody likes you, adults don't want to listen to you, the world doesn't care what you have to say, and that actually kind of fits with the sense of humor of the game. And there was a question of what party size. If it's a party of 5, those 4 boys and you kicking ass, we have to balance all the combat for 5 people. And there's also this expectation of if one of them starts talking, they're probably all going to play off each other. And that's a lot of incidental dialogue to write. It's interesting, the story they wanted to tell, it was really important that there'd be solo scenes. There'd be parts where you aren't with the boys, where you're on some crazy adventure and something bad happens to you, nobody believes you, because you can't talk. And if you've played the game, you'll know that there's several moments where you're by yourself for a long stretch of time. So knowing that this was going to be centered around the new kid, we decided that the player and one buddy was going to be the best way to make this game. That way you always had intimate interactions with one buddy at a time. As for what went right, kind of goes without saying that Matt and Trey actually got involved in this project. They really they made this their next big thing, and they played a central. Sorry, I just really love this photo of them. They were incredibly central to making this game. They work actually an hour away from us. They're up in Culver City. We're in Orange County. So we were able to kind of meet them on an almost weekly basis. Very early on in the game, their musical, The Book of Mormon, was quite successful, and they'd have to travel to New York and London for musical stuff, and we'd actually follow them. And between their interviews and their casting calls, they'd have meetings with us because that's how much they wanted to work on this game. And in the end, it ended up being written and voiced by Matt and Trey. So if it has that South Park feel, it's because they poured their heart and soul into it. It was really fun getting these cutscene concept arts that we'd go back and forth. We'd have really rapid iteration with South Park Digital Studios. Matt and Trey would think of an idea. Within hours, their artist might send us a concept. We might send them a concept back. And we had this great back and forth putting these cutscenes together. And that script over there was an interesting artifact for me. Very early on, we would get really great cutscene writing, because when you're thinking about what makes a game funny, you think about cutscenes. But when you actually make a game, you also have to think about all the incidental dialogue. And so part of making this game was just letting Matt and Trey know. It's like, oh no, you also need to write lines for like when you're just walking by something and the buddy makes a comment. As for what went not so right, just kind of glossing over this, but there were lots of changes, lots and lots of changes. I couldn't put a number on how many different versions of the story we went through. And this picture is not anything new. I don't know if it was E3 or Gamescom or some sort of demo we were putting together. There was a trailer, and it featured Clyde becoming giant and trashing the city. And I remember a coworker of mine walked into my office and said, hey, does that mean that Clyde's going to be the final boss? No. They just put that together. Another thing that went not so right is Matt and Trey are known for pushing the envelope, which is probably no big surprise. When you're making a worldwide game, you have to just be aware of your audience. Like, you can't make fun of really sensitive people like Scientologists or the royal family or Vladimir Putin. However, Matt and Trey were really big on having Nazi zombies as enemies. Nazi zombie cows, fourth graders, adults, lots of Nazi zombies. Apparently, it's still too soon in Germany to mention Nazi stuff. I did not know this until I worked on this game. And it was really important. Yeah, I guess I'm saying that. It was really important that there be a scene where the kid got sodomized by a penis-shaped alien probe. Yeah, and that's not cool in Australia, Taiwan, and certain parts of Europe. So I don't know why. This wouldn't have been such a big problem if Grand Theft Auto hadn't ruined everything for us before. Back with the hot coffee mod, Grand Theft Auto put a bunch of smutty stuff in the game, and it wasn't easily accessible, but if you knew how a console command works, it's easily accessible. And the takeaway from it is that players will hack your smut, and so that if you have to censor something, you actually have to remove all the content from the printed media. You can't censor it at runtime. That's a big pain in the ass. Fortunately, the kid being penetrated by a big probe was a cutscene, and we could at least, on the Australian and Taiwan versions, we could cut out that cutscene and replace it with crying koala. What I find interesting is it's not censorship. If we can tell you what happens in kind of graphic detail, but we can't show you what happens in graphic detail. This is okay, showing you isn't. You be the judge. This is one for Europe. So when we heard about the problem with the Nazis, we got this fun technical manual that was showing you all the things you can and can't have in a game that's going to ship in Germany. Apparently that flag's only problematic. I don't know why. But there's a lot of things you can't have in your game that are Nazi-related. The problem was there wasn't like one cutscene featuring Nazi imagery. There was bad guys in almost every level, and cutscene art assets and location art assets, and Hitler audio tracks, because that's what Nazi zombies say in combat, is they quote Hitler. Duh. So removing these assets was a giant struggle, because every time we built a new enemy that was a Nazi zombie, we had to start breaking up the assets and managing them very carefully. And what this turned into is we had 23 different builds of the game, because as I said, we need to ship this game worldwide, and worldwide on 3 platforms. So you have to have a Koala Xbox version, a Koala PlayStation version, a Koala PC version. So yeah, that was the cost of our censorship, our testing costs went up times 23. And we also had additional production time that just had to be spent making sure that these assets all got properly sorted. And when it came time for console certification, guess how many certification processes we had? It was a lot. And of course, what could possibly go wrong with all this, right? There was some asset, I don't know if it was an audio file or an armband or something, but there was some little bit of Nazi stuff that was put into the first printing of the game. And the master discs were printed. They were ready to be put in stores. We discovered the error. And then all the discs were destroyed, and the game was delayed in Germany for 4 to 6 weeks. I don't think they actually burnt them, but it was just a bad joke of mine. So with the narrative, what really went right is, even with all this changing story, from the very beginning, we had this core thing we could work on. The new kid comes to South Park. That gave us at least a list of things to do, like, hey, let's build South Park. Hey, let's build fourth graders fighting each other, even if we don't know where the plot's going. And really, Matt and Trey's involvement is what made this game so successful. They didn't just ship it off to us. They were involved in the process. And I'm actually kind of really glad that we didn't censor anything in the game, or at least we censored them within reason. It was a really demanding technical challenge, but I think it's better for it. And Matt and Trey are actually kind of happy with the censorship solutions because it still shows you kind of the absurdity of the situation. Next, I'd like to talk about content development, how we built for this unknown game. So going into this, we knew we had several challenges, actually. We had our art style all established, but we needed to replicate it perfectly. It turned out that the best tool set for this was the Onyx Toolset, which is a proprietary in-house tool set. We use it to make Dungeon Siege 3, which looks nothing like South Park. But we used that tool set plus assets that we got from the show and sort of created a 3D world that is projected in 2D. It's kind of a mess. But we also had 15 plus seasons of show history, and there was a lot of places we could go. The kids don't stay in South Park. They go to heaven, hell, imagination land, different parts of the world. And there's the very obvious question of like, well, if we're going to have a South Park game, we'll have to go to some of those locations, right? But we didn't know what to build until the plot came together. And the plot kept changing. So sometimes we'd build a location that they'd want to go to, and they'd say, well, you know what? We're not finding this location as funny as we thought. Let's not go here. That work got cut. The levels got wasted. And they also wanted to change the maps a lot. I don't know if you've ever paid attention to South Park, but there's no consistent geography. Sometimes the school and the city hall are next to each other. Other times they're clear across town. Sometimes Kenny and Stan are next door to each other. Other times they're like across a set of railroad tracks. The show just keeps changing all the time. You can't really make a game like that. We couldn't just have a random map that changes every time you travel. That would be a little too irritating. So we told them we needed a map. We got maps. Maps. We got plenty of maps. And I'll digress for a second and say that I don't know if there is a standard model for RPG development, but at least on the successful RPGs I've been on, like, I guess this is how we put together Pillars of Eternity. We, figure out our saga. That's going to tell you, like, roughly where you're going. You build those key areas, and then you realize, oh, crap, we can't do all of this. So you finish your story with the areas you have, and you finish your quests and not have them contradict the story in the areas you have. That's how you'd normally do it, right? Well, comedy's iterative. In many ways, Matt and Trey needed to write a bunch of scenes and cut them, write a bunch of scenes and cut them. And it was hard for us to move ahead on any area because really all the levels in the game needed to be made with comic timing, which really requires a very careful hands-on touch. And we just needed to have a lot of versions that we go through so that Matt and Trey find the jokes that they really like. We also needed to get into a habit of having a quick turnaround with these guys. That's how they make their show. They get started on Friday, work Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and then the show goes live on Wednesday, and then they take a nap on Thursday. We'd sometimes get to meet with them Friday, and it was always funny to see just how hectic they were. They didn't know what the episode was going to be on Friday, but by Wednesday they'd figure it out. So we just had to get into a habit of making the game the way the show is made. But we had to work within our constraints because we couldn't just pull a story out of them. We could say work faster, but that doesn't really work. So we had to do what we could do while we were waiting for them. That meant mastering our tool set, building the town of South Park, because no matter where the story goes, we knew we had to build South Park. And we had to get ready to be really good at stitching together levels that get moved around. As for mastering our tools, I was saying earlier that we made a 3D world that was projected into 2D space. What you're seeing here is a lip syncing, you're seeing the lip syncing tool. This is a fourth grader. You're seeing kind of a projection of them. What this is behind them, there's a series of different mouth shapes, so that when the boys do their lip syncing, what's actually really happening is we sort of selectively hide and reveal all the mouths behind them, so that you never actually see all these little cardboard cutout pieces behind the player, but they really are an amalgamation of this all scrunched into 2D. They should have sent a technical artist. It's really fascinating stuff. So we need to make sure that our designers and artists work really closely together. We had them all share offices and whiteboards and levels, and we made sure that our levels always had a design component and an artist component that could each be checked out separately, so they could each see what they're doing. And SPDS means South Park Digital Studios. Sorry about that abbreviation. Those folks would give us just about daily contact from Matt and Trey. We'd sometimes, if Matt and Trey weren't available, their art director would contact us, but we really did have absolutely constant contact. And this is kind of how our levels were made, through a series of rapid iterations, sometimes on the whiteboard, sometimes on pictures we got from Matt and Trey or from our own internal concept artists. We'd have paint overs over all the areas to make sure that Matt and Trey knew there's a combat here and a puzzle bit here, so maybe put a joke here. And they might say, oh, that's too many combat things in a row, let's have another joke here. So it really was the slow back and forth of going over each area and making sure it's perfect. Sorry, I just found this on my hard drive. This is the first concept for you and Randy being probed by an alien. So I like Randy's butt in that picture. This was us putting together the abortion clinic level. What was kind of fun about this level is some of it we could build just by ripping scenes directly from the show, and we had final art in a day. Whereas there were other parts of the level that involved being inside a vent, a shot up part of the clinic that were not in the show before, so we had to make those. And this is us sort of using a composite of final assets and sort of prototype stuff to make a flow chart for Matt and Trey to see if they were cool with it. There's a level where you go into Mr. Slave's colon, and here's this level in progress. We had our concept all figured out. We knew that we wanted to have a flashlight, cell phones, mantle beads, a vibrator, everything in this man's anus. And of course, the question is, what art style does one do for the inside of a man's anus? It had to be slowly prototyped out, and eventually you get, ta-da, the final disgusting product. So, at least as far as our content creation went, what went right is we were able to build South Park and sort of force the guys to make us a map. They very slowly had some consistency in the show, and they eventually agreed upon a map. After 15 years of moving this town around constantly, we have a South Park at last. The funny epilogue to this all is if you watch the recent season, the opening has a cool 3D fly-in of the town, and it doesn't match up with that. So, oh well. What also went right is Canada. It was a really funny, wonderful morning when we got an email from Trey with his retro look for Canada, and we all thought it was perfect. What was great about this is we could get almost final art and design in really fast. It looks like Ultima 3. It's really easy to do. And when we put Canada together real quickly, it became the benchmark size for a field trip outside of South Park. And it also had a winning charm to it. This is really important because when you've been working on a game for several years and all your work's been thrown out several times over, it's nice to be working on something that is just so damn good, you know the game can't ship without it. And Canada felt like that thing that they'd be idiots to cut Canada, and they didn't. So we were also, we were able to use a lot of reach reversal, which is I don't know if that's an actual word. My spell checker says it is not. But by that I mean a lock and key system similar to Castlevania or Paper Mario. We know that you're going to be moving through a lot of spaces many times over. You're going to see South Park again and again and again. So we wanted to have things like smashable gates and alien teleportation devices and little objects that you could only shrink into when you shrunk down to gnome size. That way, when the player is going back to the world for the 19th time, they can see something new and be like, hey, I actually have a key to that lock. I should go explore it and find something. We also could always rely on kids being kids to build our encounters and our side quests. While Matt and Trey were working on the main quest, we could put together some side quests. Not all of them fit with the final story, but in many cases, we were able to actually put them back in. Mr. Henke was involved in some very early draft of the story, and we had some good content for him. And when we were putting together side quests, we're like, well, hey, we can drop a manhole anywhere. We can put a manhole in any city cell we want and have that lead down to the sewer quest to meet Mr. Henke. And sometimes this worked in reverse. Mr. Slave actually began as a side quest, but it was such a good/awful level that it got put into the critical path. And the best part was we didn't have to change any hallways. We didn't have to change any connections. We just moved Mr. Slave, and the dungeon moves. So that's easy. And really what went right is we had Matt and Trey's name brand power, because I don't know any other project that would go through this many iterations and not be canceled or just forced to finish up. But these guys are known for being perfectionists, and it works. I mean, their movie's been great, their musical's been great, their show's been great for, I think, 18 years now. So the fact that their crazy process was a known evil, the publishers were kind of cool with it. And we were able to adapt to make South Park the way they make the show, and that really helped them because I think comedy requires a lot of distillation. I think that's the best word for it. But just in seeing their process, it seemed like a lot of the areas they cut, they were funny, but I don't think they were funny as funny as Matt and Trey wanted them to be. But you'd see their favorite jokes get repeated in the next area they wrote. So there really was just a lot of iteration. That's part of their process. As for what went not so right, I mean, we had lots of edits. There's no way to get around that. That was a giant struggle. And it really did affect the duration of the game. I feel like the final game is strong, but I wish it were longer. We have so many levels that were cut that, I can't help but wish there was more to it. And I guess sort of my takeaway from the content development is that comedy requires a great deal of refinement. If I were to sum up Matt and Trey's process, it's, I guess empirical is the word I'd use. They build something, they see if it's funny, they stare at it intensely, show it to their friends, and they build it again. And it's just a lot of that. There's no real magic to it. It's just a lot of trial and error. And we also knew that it was just going to be really tough to work with, working without a final story. We couldn't really work ahead because we never knew where to go unless the story told us we could go somewhere. And at the same time, if we did build levels ahead of the story, it never really worked because you'd need comic timing, and that's why we had those like really detailed level charts because we needed to build the levels with Matt and Trey's comic timing in mind. Next, I'm going to go over RPG systems and difficulty. So we're trying to think about what this game is. I mean, it's an RPG. There's lots of different RPGs out there. I mean, Diablo's an RPG and Betrayal at Krondor are RPGs, but they have nothing in common when it comes to gameplay systems. Now, we knew that this game was going to be one where you fight for your cutscenes. It's not going to be one where you can have a lot of dialogue and have a lot of conversations. We just knew you were kind of almost like JRPG style, fighting to your cutscene. We also knew that this game needed a really easy learning curve. Not all fans of South Park play RPGs. In fact, some of them might be kind of new to gaming in the first place. And we shouldn't make a hardcore RPG, but at the same time, this game was a little bit satirical. It needed to have classes. It needed to have all the elements of an RPG, if only to make fun of them. But we also had a lot of constraints inflicted on us just by choice, by the art style of the franchise. What you're seeing is like Stan as a composite and all his little like cardboard or paper parts. What's interesting to know is that a South Park character is logically inconsistent between like its left and right facing and its front and back facing. If you were to make like 3D prints of them, they'd have some logical inconsistencies. So characters never really turn. We have a little blending animation, and then we actually recreate them built sideways or recreate them built. It's all very complicated. And just when we figured out our lip syncing system, they're like, oh, we want Jimmy as a companion. He has a lisp. So yeah, that was a fun thing to deal with. And there's also very demanding art standards for South Park. I didn't know many of these until I started playing the game. Like, Cartman's fatness is always heavier on the right than the left, and one hand is shaped like a potato, the other has a thumb. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Potato, thumb, potato, thumb, potato, thumb. And it just goes into how very nuanced they are with these details. But at the same time, they don't even stick to their own art standards because the potato hand vanished when we got the final wizard graphics for Cartman. He got a grown-up hand with more power and gravitas. So even their standards were changing. It's difficult to work with. We also had this problem that animation is our limiting reagent. We had to have kids fighting anything. In some ways, it's not a problem. Like a grown-up Nazi adult can lean down and hit a kid. But that was a big constraint to what we could have our kids do. One of the early suggestions was like, why don't you have kids like poke each other in the eyes? Like, that's a great kid attack. But if you do it against an adult, you're just kind of poking them in the knees or maybe the crotch. That doesn't look good. And you could make an alternate animation where he like leaps up in the air and pokes someone in the eyes. But what are you going to do about a cow? So this really did create a lot of limits to what we can do because we always wanted to deliver on a joke with all our abilities and weapons. Here's an early concept of one of the abilities that was planned for Jimmy. Well, not planned, but we were thinking about what we should do. And we're like, hey, how about Jimmy shoots up on steroids and rages out and beats up somebody? Because that wouldn't create more censorship issues, right? However, part of this was they wanted the big, like, swirling comic fight at the end here. But Jimmy already has a very wonky animation set, and having him fight with cows, fourth graders, aliens, that was just impossible. Compare it to Furry Friends. This is a concept that made it all the way to the final game. Here's an attack that has a bunch of rats attack some people, and there was a bunch of like clipping issues and sorting with the rats, but it was target agnostic, so it actually kind of overcame that limit that the Jimmy ability had. And we also just had changing priorities, which made making this game tough. If you've played the game, you might be surprised to know that farts were actually a late arrival to the game. they're a huge part of the combat and the exploration, but they cannibalized existing systems, so to speak. We also had, with changes to the story and changes to the area, we had changes to who you meet and who you fight. You might find this image on the internet because, yes, there were crab people in the game, and it sucks that they got cut, and we had, they were the strong armor enemies, and we had weapons designed to beat them, and when they got cut, that meant we had to find other enemies that use their shtick. We also had really time-consuming boss battles that were great and had such wonderful moments like your dad's scrotum flying at you. But the problem was there was so many intensive one-off moments that took a huge amount of work for just a few seconds of a joke. It was really a costly endeavor. And when we were thinking about combat, we always had this question of, well, what are we making? Because South Park realism is sort of a limit to us. We were looking at Good Times with Weapons, which is an episode where the kids buy some martial art weapons, and they just start imagining themselves as ninjas. And very early on, we were like, is this what the game is like? Are we going to see the game from the kids' imagination? But no, it really was a game about kids being kids. But then again, at the same time, if you watch almost any episode of South Park, part of the formula is usually halfway through, just the world goes to crazy town. I mean, Cthulhu shows up. So were we going to have a game where the characters are fighting Cthulhu at the end? And are they fighting him with a cardboard tube with duct tape wrapped around it? We didn't really know what was their realism they were going for. We had the really big question of what is a funny amount of challenge? I don't think being frustrated is a good position to be in to enjoy humor. I think if you tell someone a joke and kick them in the nuts, you're more successful than if you kick them in the nuts and then tell them the joke. And as much as I love a good challenging game, we just couldn't make the player fail too often because every time you fail and you have to repeat some content, you're repeating a joke. You're kind of destroying the chance that the player is going to play the game a second time because if they always have to hear the joke twice just to beat it, there's no fun there. And the worst part is if someone is failing repeatedly, the joke's going to be more insulting than funny, and now it's kind of working against you. And I think all of us sometimes want to make really tough final dungeons and really challenge a player to use all that they've learned. But if you make a super tough dungeon and your player can't finish the end, you fail as a comedian because no one's going to see your punchline. I always find RPGs kind of have a problem in that I think they're a very punitive sort of game to play. If you know what you're doing at the beginning of an RPG, you make a lot of great choices, you get to the middle part of the game and you're kicking ass and you're getting a bunch of great items, then you get to the end, and the game's really easy because you've broken it already. And I think D&D is a great example of this. If you, at least third edition, if you started playing D&D third edition not knowing what feats to choose and what ability scores to take, the longer you play the game, just the more terrible your character gets, and you're almost punished for not knowing what you're doing. It almost kind of reminds me of American capitalism. The only way to be successful is to be born rich. Seems kind of weird. And there's this kind of RPG grind element that's sort of assumed a staple of the genre. And I think really what it means is you expect time spent in the game to power up your alter ego. No one plays World of Warcraft and says at level 1, I should be able to beat anybody if I just use my abilities at the right time and I'm really good with my mouse and clicking. No, there is some level of spending time playing the game to level people up is just part of the genre. The problem is that RPG grinding is really kind of the exact opposite of comic timing. It's not something new and something unexpected. It's the same thing over and over again. It's really not what we needed for this game. And there's also the problem of every time you give the player a choice, and there's good and bad choices, some people are going to choose the bad choices. If you offer a class system, you're kind of saying, yes, the fighter might be really good against X and Y, and when you get to Y, sorry, you chose the fighter. Ideally, players might know how to play to their weaknesses, but if they don't, they might feel frustrated by these choices. If you have really interesting items that have lots of cool bonuses to them, you run the possibility that the player doesn't know how to use their inventory really well, and they just keep failing the more they go along the game because they don't know how to level up their gear properly. And if you let someone level up their character slowly, they can reach the end of the game and realize that they've put together a train wreck. And what do you do for them at that point? Are they going to start the game all over again? In a game like South Park, we'd hope, but we really don't want people getting into that position in the first place. So with all this, we had to figure out what kind of game we're making and what can we do. We need to work within our constraints and think about what the player actually has control over. And it all comes down, in my mind, to choice of style and choice of execution. So I think one of the staples of all RPGs is having an alter ego that you customize and create. And this is something that we wanted to take to an extreme level in South Park. And despite all the art challenges of getting all these little hairs and outfits and skin tones to work when you turn sideways, and we had problems with a lot of the the scenery would cause the African skin tone to blend in. But we did a lot of tricks to get you to be able to make an avatar that has just a lot of customizable options. We have costumes that you can mix and match, and you can really, it's like playing World of Warcraft and having giant shoulder pads. There's the option for you to express your South Park style. The website at South Park Digital Studios for many years before this game was created had an avatar creator that was just radically successful. And it's really nice, whenever I see people play this game, almost everybody usually makes themselves as a South Park character. They might get bored and make a freaky appearance of themselves later, but it's really nice to see how everybody expresses themselves as a South Park character. We also needed to have a choice of execution, and I should probably explain that. So playing to what we could and couldn't do. We knew that this was not a game of you accepting a quest and then finding, which of the 5 solutions do I want to do this quest. That would be cool in New Vegas, but we couldn't get away with this here. And it also wasn't a game where you're navigating your dialogue. So if you can't influence the cutscene, at least we give the player the choice of what happens on the way to the cutscene. So when it came to encounters, we have this question of do you assess an ambush, direct attack, or sneak around? In many of our setups, there's bad guys who are hanging out near maybe a little light fire source, and you could fart on that and make an explosion and kill someone and not have to deal with them in combat. Or if you really like combat, you could just dive right in. And there are also abilities to use the sneaky squeaker or using your ranged weapon to stun people. I don't think we had enough moments in the game where you could avoid combat entirely, but there are plenty of moments where you could just sneak around. And when you got into combat, it was really important that there be more ways, multiple ways to kill people, be a lot of redundant options. There's 2 kinds of weapons. You have your own set of abilities, you have your farts, you have a whole bunch of items, you have your buddy with their abilities. There's multiple ways to kill all the enemies in the game, and that's entirely intentional because there's an arcade component to all our attacks where you push a button when you time your attack to do extra damage, you push a button when you're being attacked to take less damage. Some of those games might not be intuitive to some players, and if we got them in a position where hey, to beat this boss, you have to use this ability that has a little timing game that you suck at, we'd lose a lot of players. So hopefully every boss has a few options you can use to tackle them. And we struggled for a while to find the right way to do funny combat. It was requested at first that combat be kind of frenetic and be sort of real-time, but that's not really the best mindset to be in for humor, I think. It's hard to stop and laugh when you're always alert and trying to block or trying to expecting an attack. And because we had all these little mini games with the button presses, it was really important that we have the one kid in motion for clarity. You need to know when it was your turn, and you have to worry about your own button presses, and you need to know when it's the bad guy's turn, so you can worry about your defensive button presses. We really just needed to make this a framed duel and not a swirling melee. That was kind of the takeaway. And the best part was going to a turn-based system gave us control of the buddy. And this is, I think, really important because, again, you don't have the option to select Cartman and then get into a conversation and say, hey, Cartman, say this. Hey, Cartman, say this. But what you can do is you can bring him along in combat and have him do funny things in combat. So it's maybe not as cool as having him talk for you, but it's cool that you get to control him in some degree. And we struggled for a long time finding the difficulty sweet spot. This game needed to have all the RPG systems, but really it needed to have enough compromises to players who don't necessarily know what they're doing. One of the things we did was we standardized the class abilities. Every class has an ability that stuns. Every class has an ability to overcome defenses. Every class has an ability that removes status effects. We just wanted to make sure that the player never got into an encounter or a boss where one class was just really screwed unless you were a master of the game systems. I think it cost us some variety, but I don't think we were making a game that we expected everybody to play many times over. So that was an acceptable loss. We had really powerful consumables. You could use an item and then make an attack, so you could always be healing yourself. And that was actually really intentional because we wanted to prevent a failure spiral, because you might get in a situation where your buddy's knocked out, and if spending an item costs you your turn to get him back up, well, now the enemies keep attacking, and you'll almost never get out of that bind. And really, I'd rather have the player spend a bunch of items, spend 5 minutes grinding for more items, and then spend 5 minutes replaying the same combat, because I think it's just more fun to make some progress and then spend some time replacing your consumables. We also made the choice of resetting your hit points and power points after fights. This was mostly because a really novice player might not know the RPG staple of, yeah, you have to drink a healing potion after combat, duh. And it could be really frustrating to see people fail that early on. But this actually turned out to be a really huge gain for us, because resetting the player's stats every fight allows us to balance the enemies to beat on a fresh target. So we have high damage values on both sides, which make our combats run really fast. We can actually only do that because we're resetting the hit points and power points every fight. We also needed to make sure that The player got their tools to succeed in the right order. And part of this meant tying different upgrades to different activities in the game. Progressing through the plot gives you your farts and your abilities. And if you've played the game, you'd know that that is kind of all the heavy lifting in combat. I mean, your items matter, but these are the signature power abilities. So as long as you're progressing through the game, you're getting what you need to deal with all the challenges that come your way. On the reverse end, grinding gave you money, which is really just additional item options and additional flair. And most of the really good items were actually level limited anyway, so you could never grind to get ahead of the plot, so to speak. We also made sure that there were trophies because there should be something for people who like grinding. It is an RPG after all. And a lot of the trophies are based around like buying all the costumes, buying all the weapons, and you can only do that by grinding. In the middle, for exploration, the rewards for exploration are perks and items. The perks you get from friends, and those are RPG bonuses that are independent of level. And that was very important because we didn't know in what order the player was going to explore South Park and meet a bunch of friends. So we wanted to make sure that those upgrades were good, whether you got them at level 1 or level 20. Generally, I think the way we tried to approach difficulty is by having a plurality of systems where the player just needs to know a few of them. And that's a little bit of an obtuse concept, but that picture doesn't show it really well. But there's just a lot of things to read in this game. You have to read your abilities, you have to read your weapons, you have to read your items and upgrades. If you like RPG games, great, you're going to know this all. If not, it's a lot of information to soak in. So if you're really good at the little action mini games, you don't have to be a master of your inventory. But if you're not really good at the mini games and you really know how to use the inventory system really well, you'll do well. So it's really about the player needs to opt into enough systems to get through the game, but we're not demanding that they know everything. And that's really important because I think normal mode in our game is kind of easy, and easy is really easy. And again, I really like hard games, and I wish our game had a really difficult hard mode, but it's actually better this way because it's a comedy game. It shouldn't be torture. So in terms of our RPG systems and difficulty design, I think the best successes we had were we tried to minimize grinding and frustration. Even though I think RPGs are sort of designed for masochists in a little way, we tried to take that element out of it. And we wanted to think about giving the player as many choices as they can, knowing the limitations of the game. Since we knew that a lot of the cutscene and dialogue options were off the table, we wanted to think about giving the players many choices of their own personal style and their own execution of how they deal with problems. So my concluding thoughts are sort of a restatement of my original thesis, that I think good development comes from working within the boundaries of your vision, and the limits inflicted by your goals aren't always obvious at first, because no one has a great idea for a game and says, like, yeah, I have this really cool feature, but here are all the downsides of it. All you're ever thinking about is what your feature is going to do to improve gaming in general. It's hard to know what you're doing, like what doors you're closing with every good idea you make. Like, we had this really cool art style to use, but the art style put so many limits on us that, and we didn't necessarily see those limits coming until we were making the game. My other thought is that comedy is like any other kind of design. If you avoid iteration, you're avoiding perfection. It can't hurt to have a starting plan, but I don't think there are these actual comic geniuses in the world who just instantly, like, out of nowhere come up with the perfect jokes. I think like anything else, it takes work, it takes practice, and it takes exercise. And lastly, it really, really helps to have a pre-existing fan base for anything you're working on. If Pillars of Eternity and South Park Stick of Truth have taught me anything, it's that if people want your game, they'll help spread word of mouth, they'll get excited for it, your game's just going to do better. But really, my talk's kind of useless because the real way games are made is by relentless, talented professionals, many of them who go unknown and uncredited, but they're the ones who really make this game happen. We had a really great support staff at South Park Digital Studios and a really great team at Obsidian, and it wouldn't have been possible without just over 100 people really cranking on this game. So that's it. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. I'd like to answer questions about games and game designs and not famous people, if possible. And yeah, I'll try to answer your questions as best I can.
Hi, I have a question. It's about the comedy aspect in the game. It was a very long production, and how did you check that those jokes were funny in the end? Yeah, it's like...
That's a good question. It's about, it was a long production cycle, and how do you know that jokes stay funny at the end? I have to admit, by the time the project was done, I had heard so many of the jokes so many times that I, for one, was desensitized to a lot of them. And that's difficult because you have to remember that what you're doing is funny, because without the humor, the game can seem kind of flat. Kind of how I solved that is we luckily had a friends and family playtest, and for me it was just nice to get my friends to come in. I'd space it every once in a while. So like, hey, come see the game. They'd play it, they'd laugh, and that would actually kind of just help reaffirm that what you're doing is right. But that actually is a really good question. I don't know the secret to it, but yeah, when you work on a comedy game, you get bored of your own material, and it's really tough to sometimes know which things you should keep, because you might get bored of jokes that are really, really funny to everybody else who haven't seen them yet. So, any other questions?
I'm just curious, was Al Gore so tough by design at the beginning, or it was just an accident?
Very good question. Al Gore was actually meant to be tough because he's one of the few sort of optional bosses. And he actually was one of our attempts at making a more challenging boss fight. I'm actually really glad that you noticed that, because
Yeah, I noticed that because there was one very frustrating thing, this spam.
yes,
And I wanted to get rid of this spam and I couldn't.
that was exactly the intended. As I said, you really shouldn't frustrate the player, but every once in a while, frustrating the player can be funny. Yeah. And what was really great is I liked his global warming ability that put a doom on you for I think something like 300 turns. If you actually sat there and fought him for 300 turns, you would die. But I remember testers just sitting there and being like, "Is it going to work after 300 turns? Yeah, test it. Please test it." And yeah. Any other questions?
Did Mods and Trade do all of the writing on the game?
I'm pretty sure about all the writing. We had a writing staff. It was mostly Eric Fenstermaker, who was the narrative designer on Pillars of Eternity. I did some ghost writing here and there. I think, though, we put in, like, stubbed in dialogue, like, hey, this is a bark string. Hey, this is a conversation with an NPC. Hey, Matt and Trey, can you get to this line? I'm pretty sure they put final jokes and everything, but there's enough text in the game that maybe there's a couple lines that we wrote, but really, yeah, they took a look at everything. They wanted to make sure that it had their touch.
So a follow-up question. So how many words were there?
I know that it was close to about 2 seasons of South Park, but I'm not a producer and I can't remember the numbers very well. I'm sorry. I just know the relative values. Any other questions?
Hi. Have you learned any lessons from designing this game that are applicable in other games, not necessarily comedies?
That's a good question. Certainly, there is a concern that this is a game unlike anything I will probably ever make again. And so, yeah, when I was unpacking my thoughts for this talk, there was a great apprehension in that, like, oh man, I'm going to be talking about stuff that I don't know if anyone's ever going to apply. But I think actually, this game was a triumph of iteration. And I think even serious games can benefit from having very ruthless cutting. Yeah. I guess that's my best answer to that question. Sorry. Any other questions?
This is the last one, I promise. If you would work on your own IP and not something which is not yours, would you change your approach to comedy design? Would you, if there are some things you would change because you wouldn't have those constraints?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I guess I'd actually do it pretty similarly. Like I think if I were to make another comedy game, I'd want to keep it, low frustration, lots of systems that you can buy into. It would have to have a lot of iteration because really empty moments are the death of a comedy game. When you don't have a lot of trimming, you end up with these sequences of walking around and nothing happens, and you lose interest. So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I'd approach it any differently if we were to make another comedy game, come to think of it. Like, as grueling as this game was to make, it was a successful way to make a comedy game, as odd as that sounds. So, yeah.
Right, so you seem like a, hardcore RPG player, and you did give this vibe during your presentation. And so, while making the game less frustrating for the player, how frustrated were you while basically dumbing down the game and and making it less for yourself, basically?
I guess the diplomatic answer is very. Um, um, I had mentioned that I really wish hard mode was harder. Closing down this game was really difficult, and one of, I think, my own personal failings is I didn't budget time to sit down and play the game a bazillion times over on hard difficulty and make that really hard. So I guess I did dislike dumbing down the game a little bit, even though it was the right thing to do for the game, but I was kind of hoping that we would find time to make a hard difficulty that really was incredibly challenging. And so I'm kind of sad that that didn't happen.
It's incredibly hard to design a game not for yourself.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is a little bit irritating, but I mean, to be honest, I enjoyed the challenge of making an RPG system that, like, my mom could figure out. My mom's actually really smart. I don't know why I said that, but she doesn't play games. She's smarter than me, but she doesn't play games and gets frustrated really quickly, like vacuum cleaners and microwaves. So if I took joy in the challenge of not making like the most hardcore, difficult RPG, but more in like, you know, could I make a game that like all my relatives could play? Because I'm like the only one in my family who games, and that sucks.
Rather not a question, just a thought. In the final battle, every time the boss was performing special attack, then Buddy has a special counter attack, and I defeated the boss with 2 buddies, and it was cool, it was awesome. But then I saw on YouTube how someone, another person was playing, and there were many other cutscenes from all characters, so cutting the head from the dead unicorn, awesome. But I had quite mixed feelings because I couldn't see the cool stuff because my character was too strong.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Part of what made our boss battles so difficult is we had, there were certain jokes that just had to happen. Like, you know, Chef had to deliver some lines before you kill him. But at the same time, if you really were maxing out your stats and kicking ass, we did kind of want to let you kick some more ass. That's an interesting observation that I think is actually a good point. Like, in that particular battle, it probably was worth maybe just, you know, making the bad guy auto-scale to you so you see more of those jokes. That's a really good observation. Like, it sucks to spend all those time on those really complicated scenes. Each one of those, like as you said, the unicorn decapitation was a very expensive scene to make. And so, yeah, it is unfortunate that some people miss out on that content. But that was us actually trying to reward the player for being really good at the systems at the end. So, yeah, absolutely. If you miss something, there's always YouTube. So, any other questions? I think we have time. Do we have time? Cool. Is that it? Cool. Well, thank you so much for listening.